Okay, let's get started on chapter 29. We have a lot of different styles to cover here, from Fauvism to German Expressionism, from Cubism to Futurism, Dada, Surrealism, um, and elements of sculpture that incorporate a lot of these different styles. So, chapter 29, and we're going to be discussing modernism in Europe. And we kind of talked about what modernism is in the last chapter, and that it's a very quick societal shift of activities that are occurring throughout Europe at this time. And we'll talk about how it transfers over to America and into Mexico in the next chapter with Ribera and Diego and Frida Kahlo and other individuals such as that. So what's going on is during this time, art is actually questioning its own purpose and its own form, and a lot of that has to do to wars. Both great wars are going to ensue at this time, World War I and World War II, and that's going to create constant industrial shifts in society from country to country. And the artists at this time are going to essentially respond and react to a lot of what's going on during this time. And what's going to be generated is something called an avant-garde. And what an avant-garde is going to do, and a lot of these are avant-garde, which means that they're very kind of future thinking. They're before their time, if you will. So there will be moments when hold on a second. There will be moments when a style of art will become very prominent, and then it will quickly shift into another type of art very quickly. And Pablo Picasso, is really going to be a purveyor and a harbinger of a lot of these ideas. And they're going to embrace the need for these constant shifts in art by questioning the purpose of the origin of some of these different styles. So criticizing themselves quite often is really what is going to ensue at this time. And it happened with the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists and the Realists prior to this modernism in Europe. So this avant-garde movement and all these different movements that I just read off, all these different styles, are going to kind of equate or associate themselves with the Impressionist, Realist, and Post-Impressionist, seeing them as like scouts of future vision, which really is what avant-garde means. It's originally a political group of scouts that would go out and research and look what the field of politics or the field of warfare would look like prior to actually engaging in combat or engaging in discourse or argumentation on a political level. So the artists at this time are going to take this avant-garde mentality and shift it over into the art field. And they're going to see their predecessors, the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists and the Realists, as really the first avant-garde movement. And now they're going to take on this narrative of avant-garde through Fauvism and then all the way into Cubism and then, of course, continuing all the way up to Surrealism and going from there. Okay, so the first that we're going to look at is the school of Fauvism, and they're criticized for having simple designs and shock of bright colors. Now, I start with the word criticized because you got to realize that most of these movements at this time were criticized quite heavily by the formalists and the classicists prior to these new avant-garde movements. Okay, the Impressionists were criticized, the Post-Impressionists were criticized in the last chapter, and it really wasn't except for the Realists that were coming out of the neoclassical kind of approach to art making with conventional rendering of form and figure and space and time and all that. They were really the only ones that weren't that heavily criticized. But as soon as the Impressionists like Claude Monet comes into the scene, the criticism starts to skyrocket, and it just keeps going. But it's good because with this critical vision, it's creating a conflict, like visually and aesthetically, but then that helps to make you question or think, really, what is the purpose of artwork at this time? So the more you're inquiring and using your critical thinking skills on why something is made and why it looks the way it is, where is it coming from contextually, and in what is its content, it makes you think psychologically more, and you develop more cellular developments in your brain. So it's actually a very biological tool to criticize, and constructively, of course. And through that constructive criticism, you develop new possibilities and new wavelengths of thought. And during this time, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung are going to come on the scene, which were psychoanalysts. And so this whole idea of diving deep into the unconscious and subconscious is going to rise up, if you will, during this time. So a lot of thought, almost like an extension of enlightenment, but through psychology, is going to develop here. And you got to realize with the Great Wars, there's a lot of psychological turmoil going on. And with that comes Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, so that allows for a healing kind of process of what the fragmentation of war has done internally in a person, as well as what's happening externally throughout all these nations in Europe. And again, the artists are going to want to reflect that system of psyche. So these Fauvists, F-A-U-V-I-S-M, are going to be really the first on the scene during this modernistic European time, coming out of the post-impressionist and the symbolist that we saw in the last chapter. And again, they're going to be criticized for simple designs and shock of bright colors. And faux, F-A-U-V-E-S, actually means wild beast. So they're considered wild artists. They're not considered well trained because of their use of simple designs and shock of bright colors. And what they wanted to do is be very direct and spontaneous, like the Impressionist that we saw in the last chapter. But they wanted to use very contrasting colors to do it, versus a mood of capturing a motion and quick shifting spontaneous time and trying to figure out how to do that with the Impressionists. They're actually going to use very sharp and contrasting colors, which actually we saw with the post-impressionist Van Gogh. So a lot of these Fauvists are going to rely on the expressive, contrasting, sharp, almost jagged-like shifts of color that we saw with Van Gogh's painting, Night Cafe in particular, as well as subtly in Starry Night. And they're going to transition those styles, especially from Van Gogh, into this faux movement. And they're also going to want to play on emotions and what do colors do emotionally to you. So there's two different types of colors. There's warm colors and there's cool colors. Warm colors have a tendency to really make you feel energetic, like reds and yellows and oranges. And then cool colors, greens and blues, are meant to make, they're called cool colors, and they're meant to like calm you down a little bit more. So for example, if you go to a fast food joint and they want you in and out really quickly, let's say McDonald's, they're going to use really bright warm colors like yellows and reds and oranges. They want you to feel energized and excited and buy your food and get out. And then the next person's in line. Versus a sit-down restaurant, it's often a combination of cool colors to make you feel relaxed and calm, and you're going to stay longer, and you're going to buy more, and your bill's going to be bigger, and then more money's going to go to the business. The tip's going to be larger for the waiter or for the server. So that's a psychological use of color, and the Fauvists were some of the first to do that. So how color will affect emotions. And they'll use rich surface textures like what Van Gogh will do. So they'll really build up the brush strokes to really create a sense of depth and texture on the canvas. Then they wanted to release internal emotions, and how they would do that through this psychological use of color to get a certain mood is they'll actually use very specific colors. They'll use vermilion and emerald greens, which will give you your cool, relaxed tones, and they'll also use a cerulean blue. Okay, so vermilion and emerald greens and cerulean blue to give you your cool tones and moods. Then they'll boom suddenly hit you with pops of heavy red, bright red, as well as vivid orange to suddenly energize that area. And whenever you have vivid reds and vivid oranges, you are looking at what are called focal points, Focal points. And that means that you're going to gravitate towards that area, stay there, be energized, and then the cool colors like the emerald green and cerulean blue are going to move you around softly around those warm colors, and you're going to feel this emotional shift back and forth. And what the Fauvists is going to do is they're going to pave the way for the German Expressionist as well as the Cubist that we're going to look at. So German Expressionists we'll look at with Kandinsky and Schiele, and then we'll look at, of course, Pablo Picasso and Gonzalez in regards to the Cubist. Okay, so who is our first person? Who is our main person that we want to talk about with Faux? And that is figure 29.3, Henri Matisse. Red Room, Harmony in Red. Okay, so how is he breaking this down using simple designs as well as bright colors? So what he's doing, he simplified the composition by flattening the forms, almost like a schematic diagram. So if you look at like a schematic diagram of something that almost looks like all aerial parts before you take all these components and put them together to build the object, he's doing the same thing. He's flattened the table, he's flattened the chair, there's not much dimensionality to it. He's flattened the window in the background where it actually kind of looks like a painting as well. The overall cornicing and the framing that's around the window is flattened. Everything is flattened. It almost all runs together. So the flatness of the wall is in continuation with the flatness of the table. And the use of red is harmonizing, hence harmony in red, is harmonizing the whole entire composition. But it's contrasted very quickly by this cerulean blue, which you see kind of weaving in and out of the composition. All right, so the red is that vivid pop of energy, but then it's softened and calmed by this cerulean blue that's moving around. And different saturations and different values of that blue is being used. But there's one solid saturation and value of the red that's harmonizing it completely. Right, so that's the use of simple colors as well as these contrasting and shock of bright colors. This is something that was not really done at all prior to, except for with Van Gogh, who was not popular at his time. So he was considered avant-garde to what's going on with the Fauvist movement. So he flattened the front edge of the table, for example, and it's as flat as the wall behind it, like I talked about. And the window could either, like I said, be a painting or it could be a window into the outside. We're not quite sure. Everything is so flattened that it could be either or, which was, again, a need of using shocking colors and simple forms to unify. This is also something that Cezanne did with his analytical studies in post-impressionism in the last chapter. And then the constantly contrasting colors. And one thing, real quick, a little history on this, is that it was originally, where it is red, it was all green. And he wasn't satisfied. It still didn't feel harmonized. Okay, it was still too cool. It was still too calm. So then he came in and he turned it all blue. So he went from a vermilion emerald green to a cerulean blue, and then finally into this vivid red. And then whenever he did the vivid red, all the cool colors that you see in here suddenly popped. Okay, they suddenly made sense. And so that's why the vermilion and emerald green, as well as the cerulean blue and these vivid orange and reds, were so prominent with the Fauvists, because those were the three main that Matisse went through to create this Red Room Harmony in Red. Okay, it has a lot to do with Matisse's personal decisions. Okay, so let's see how these Fauvists actually how they will influence the German Expressionist. And we're going to look at Kandinsky, figure 29.7. So let me give you a little breakdown of what the German Expressionism is all about. So it's meant to be very dramatic and emotional. Okay, very dramatic and emotional. And you got to realize that in 1912, when this was done, though Kandinsky is actually Russian, he's not German. He moved to Munich, became part of the German scene. Is that it was the Germans that moved forward with starting the first Great World War One, and then also World War Two with Adolf Hitler. So the individuals that kind of followed like lemmings behind these acts of political engagement of warfare with German leadership, with Deutsch and German leadership, they may not necessarily agree with those actions, and this is a response to that. Okay, so the Germans are going to be very dramatic and very emotional because they almost have had that suppressed in this socio-political environment that the German leadership is choosing to create these wars around Europe. And they, as artists and individual folks that are under that country's rule as citizens, have had to suppress how maybe they felt about the engagement of warfare. They might have disagreed. And that this is a reaction and a reaction adjustment to a lot of that. And what I mean by reaction adjustment is a psychological healing from a reaction that they could not originally be part of because they might have been suppressed, or like it might have been frowned upon if they would have rejected what the German government wanted to do. So with that comes a very dramatic and emotional reaction during this time. So we have that going on, and then of course they learned from the foes. They learned from the wild beasts. They learned from Matisse, and so that of course is implementing simple shapes, as you see with Figure 29.7, Improvisation 28. Simple shapes as well as suddenly contrasting bright colors. Okay, same concepts, but there's a little difference with the German expressionists versus that of the foes. So let's break that down. So what they would do is they would express mostly by using distorted forms, ragged outline, and agitated brushstrokes. Now that should sound familiar. Van Gogh, he would do the same thing. He would express, but emotionally he would express through the figural form, through the human form. But here, the German expressionists are feeling this, are using the same elements of distortion as well as ragged outlines and this use of agitated brushstrokes, but with simple objective forms, or just simple forms, not objective, just simple forms. And then color. So it's all about form and color. It's not about how form and color creates a human figure narrative like with Van Gogh, or a landscape like with Starry Night, or the figure in Night Cafe, but it's the same concept, but it's transferred over to just objects, just simple objects, simple forms. Okay, and the use of contrasting colors like what Matisse did as a faux painter. So with Kandinsky, Improvisation 28, he's actually part of one of two different schools in the German Expressionists, and they're called Der Blaue Reiter, which actually, which is derived and they learned from the foes, and it's literally named after Kandinsky and a few others' love for the color blue and horses. So in this, there's supposed to be a reference to horses to a degree, as well as obviously the color of cerulean blue and different values and different saturations of blue hues. So that's literally what Der Blaue Reiter means. It means a love for blue and horses. So it's quite literal. But the paintings themselves are not literal at all. They're very, again, simple shapes as well as contrasting colors that make it a bit obscured, and it's not really that easy to see exactly where these love for the horse may be. Blue is pretty obvious, but not so much the horse. So they want the abstraction to actually be the subject. All right, so the abstraction is the subject. The object is not the subject. All right, the narrative is the move of abstraction using simple form and simple shapes and color. So this is the first we're going to start to see the embrace and the elevation of the abstracted form and shape being the subject matter, which is an oxymoron, right? An abstraction is often a deterrent from a subject matter because a subject matter is often scientifically recorded as a tangible object of focus and observation. But in this case, with the abstract as the focus of subject, it creates this almost dichotomy, or this questioning element of what should be the subject, which again I talked about is the whole point of modernism, is to have art question its purpose and form. So you got to realize everything around them is questionable in nature, because one building gets blown up, this road gets ran over by a tank, these 7,000 people suddenly die over here in this other village because of great wars and social fragmentation. So again, that is a big contextual component as to why suddenly things look so fragmented and shifted. But Kandinsky actually has a love for the sciences and for music in particular. So let me get into that. So this actually has a lot to do with that. So Kandinsky will deflect figural association by using musical metaphors, and even the title itself, Improvisation 28, is meant to relate to an idea of a musical score. So instead of putting a title that represents, like he could have said, blue slash through horse or something like that as a title, then you would search for where the blue might be creating the horse. He's creating this musical kind of compositional element in his visual composition. And he will combine the use of science and also a love for mysticism. So he actually was studying a lot of philosophies and religions coming from the East at this time. So I'm not going to get into that because this is not a religious course, but there is that, and I don't want to exclude it. I want you to know that he's looking at levels of spirituality in combination with science. So his artwork will find a fusion between that of the visual, that of the musical, that of the religious, and also and more of a spiritual religiosity, and that of the sciences. So the new sciences were saying at this time that material objects are inferior. So we're looking at the study of physics, we're looking at the study of chemistry, where things are starting to burrow into actual non-material activities like gravity, which is non-material in nature, air, non-material in nature, the shifting of chemicals and how that is at a cellular or a almost not a subatomic but an atomic level. So the idea of the object is actually built on all of these different more deep levels of scientific and molecular, atomic, and non-material or anti-material existences. So with that, the artwork is starting to reflect that a little bit here. And he saw that music was actually a big reinforcer to the scientific discoveries. And so he will use color, line, form, and space like musical notes. So he's moving the color, the line, the shape, the forms around the painting almost like he's generating a musical score. All right, so that's what's very present here, is he's combining all of these new heavy sciences with his love for music and his love for the faux movement, which is simple form and contrasting color, and he's shifting them around the composition to make it look like it's a visual musical performing score or composition. All right, so that's Kandinsky. And now we'll finish up with the German Expressionism, and in the next video we'll talk about Cubism and Futurism. And we'll finish with Schiele, figure 29.10. Now, Schiele did not put himself in any category, and he really was a standalone artist, okay? And he was very prolific, but he didn't live very long, and he passed away of the Spanish flu. And a lot of the artwork that he made was very distorted, and again played on that expression, German expression of mostly distorted forms, ragged outlines, and agitated brushstrokes. So he falls within the category of German expressionism, but he wasn't in a school or a certain group or movement of German expressionists. He just did his own thing, and then throughout time, over the past 100+ years, he's just kind of been scooped into the German expressionist group, if you will. So this is nude self-portrait. So this is himself, and he was an individual artist. He really didn't run around with anybody in particular. He just did his own thing. He's not connected to anyone. And he wanted to express, again, very intense emotional states, like we talked about with the distorted forms and using jagged outlines, which are very present here. His body is elongated, almost like that manneristic style that we saw at the end of the Renaissance and into the Baroque period. And then the jagged outlines, the contour of the body is very jagged. It's not very straight. It's very distorted. And then agitated brushstrokes that he's picking up from the Fauves, from Matisse, as well as from the post-impressionists like Van Gogh. Now, the reason he made things very intense and emotional in nature is because he actually watched his father pass away in a very harsh way through syphilis. And so whenever he does these nudes, and everything was nude with him, and the reason everything was nude is because he actually wanted to create an asexual disposition through these distortions and through these ragged outlines and agitated brushstrokes. Because he saw what syphilis as a venereal disease did to his father, and it killed his father. So that's why in all of these pieces that you see by Schiele, they're connected to sex, but with physical and emotional pain and death. All right, so he almost was, in a sense, channeling chastity by portraying this nudity as an act of painful derivative in pain, and then also in death, because of his personal experience and anguish that he had to suffer through watching his father die of syphilis. So that's why he's grimacing. You see his face, it's grimacing because he finds it disgusting, because he saw this level of torture happen from these physical acts. So that's why, if any other pieces that you look up on the internet, there will often be some kind of distortion or grimacing act in the nude, because sex is equated with physical and emotional pain and death. And he is one of the first to really break the border of the artwork. So what I mean by that is his right elbow and his lower legs are cut off. And that's something that wasn't very typical leading up to this German Expressionist period. It was often the body disappeared because another object was in the way. It wasn't the border of the painting or of the drawing that made the appendages disappear or be cut off. This is new. This is a new invention. So he cut off limbs, and they used transparent skin. And again, it's supposed to reinforce that element of physical and emotional aggravation from the nudity aspect and the exposure of what nudity can ultimately lead to, which can be disease, pain, and death. So that's why he cuts different parts of the body away to re-emphasize that, and then makes the skin transparent as if he's ghostly in nature by being exposed in the nude. And he's breaking from classical nude the most than anyone, and that's because of these distortions, these jagged lines, and also these agitated brushstrokes, and then breaking again part of the appendages of the body, which is something that is not classical at all. So he's not referring to any classical nude studies. Again, that's really what puts him in his own category. So he's really just ultimately saying that physical features really don't have a purpose, and he's being very asexual about it, and he's really kind of pushing the way, even though he's using sexual or nudity as his platform, it's supposed to create the opposite effect. It's an indirect attack on the element of nudity in general. So that is really ultimately his motto behind what he's doing. All right, that is your first video, and we'll get into Cubism and Futurism in the next.